He'd been away from it for a while, the police told me. I'm so sorry. That's okay. Grief has a strange way of folding into time, like a photograph worn soft at the edges, and few in the dazzling halls of classic Hollywood wore their sorrow so gracefully or so invisibly as Barbara Eden. To the world she was eternal light, the immortal sparkle in a bottle, enchanting generations with a playful wink and a swirl of pink smoke. But behind the fantasy curtain, beyond the dreamlike desert of I Dream of Jeannie, lived a woman of secrets, survival, and sorrow. A woman forged not in magic, but in fire. Her story doesn't begin in television's technicolor glow, but in the dusty heart of Tucson, Arizona, in the last lean years before the Great Depression bit into America like a silent plague. August 23, 1931, a child named Barbara Jean Moorhead is born beneath a sun too hot, in a world too fragile. She is not yet Eden. Her father Hubert and mother Alice split when she's only 3. Little Barbara is pulled away from her father's arms and transplanted to El Paso, Texas, a different desert, a different loneliness. She clutches tight to her grandfather, the first man she will ever trust. I loved him dearly, she would later write, and in those words is a wistfulness, as if even then, love was something to be held carefully, briefly, before time snatches it away. The world around her shrinks with every economic tremor. They have no money. They live under one roof with aunts and uncles, surviving by faith and laughter. During the week, her stepfather, a lineman, climbs telephone poles like a ghost of modernity threading through a dying past. And her mother, oh, her mother sang, not for crowds, not for records, but in the kitchen, in the quiet, in the way only mothers do when they are trying to keep the darkness at bay. Barbara listens. Something in that voice stirs her, a longing, a rhythm, a kind of hope. It wasn't fame that called to her at first, it was escape. The stage, she would come to believe, is the only place in the world where you can be both someone else and your truest self. San Francisco becomes the new stage of her youth, fog-laced, shadow-kissed, and pulsing with stories. She graduates high school in 1949, and the city, with all its jazz clubs and dreams half-spoken in smoky alleyways, begins to shape her. But destiny doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it comes wrapped in awkward suggestions. One of her teachers notices her shrinking, not in talent, but in spirit, and nudges her toward the impossible. Enter a beauty pageant. It sounds ridiculous. She's not vain. She's shy. But something in her is tired of disappearing. And so, in 1951, she walks onto a stage as a contestant in the Miss San Francisco pageant, and walks off as a winner. Imagine the moment, standing there in a bathing suit under the blinding heat of stage lights, the hush of judgment in the air like an electric hum. She's terrified. But she does it, and what she doesn't know yet is that this moment, this single trembling victory, will be the pivot point of her entire life. From that moment, the world no longer sees Barbara Jean Moorhead. It sees something else. Potential, marketable beauty, star material. But beauty is never the full truth. Hollywood devours beauty. It exalts it, then cheapens it. By the time Barbara Eden arrives in Los Angeles, the golden age of film is cracking at the seams. The old studio gods are dying. The streets are littered with the ghosts of ingenues, some forgotten, some institutionalized, some still grinning in the corners of cocktail parties, praying for a screen test that will never come. Barbara navigates it like a survivor, careful, warm, but never foolish. She changes her name. She molds herself into the image of a starlet, blonde, wide-eyed, always smiling. But inside, the girl from Tucson watches it all with caution. She is not naive. She knows this place trades in illusions. Then comes the bottle. 1965, I Dream of Jeannie. A show so feather-light on the surface, and yet beneath it, something strange, something ancient. A genie, a servant, sealed in glass, emerging to love and obey. A fantasy, yes, but not an innocent one. Audiences fell in love instantly. They couldn't help themselves. The pink harem outfit, the kindness, the voice that wrapped itself around every man's childhood memory like a silk ribbon. Barbara Eden became an icon overnight. But the bottle, in its own way, became a prison. For years, she was Genie, nothing more. Casting directors couldn't see past it. Even as the culture shifted and darker, grittier stories emerged, Barbara remained timeless, which in Hollywood means untouchable, unreachable, and often unhirable. But time does not stop, even for icons. As Barbara Eden aged, the town that once begged for her image quietly turned its back. She experienced a loss that no parent should ever have to bear: the death of her son Matthew from a heroin overdose. The same public who once adored her now whispered in gossip columns. She endured it with silence, with poise, with the same strength that carried her through poverty, divorce, loneliness, and the unbearable weight of being everyone's fantasy but no one's reality. And still, she smiled. Not the smile of performance, but the smile of someone who has made peace with her ghosts. What makes Barbara Eden's story so haunting is not just her success, but what it reveals about the systems that create and destroy our idols. She was a product of the American dream, yes, but also a prisoner of it. We remember her as the genie, cheerful, radiant, eternal. But beneath that lie decades of struggle, silent grief, and the quiet, invisible labor of a woman holding herself together for the sake of a world that needed her to keep pretending. So we see her in the supermarket. We think she can do it and recover. She can't, but she carries on. In every photograph you can see it. Look closer. Beyond the gowns, beyond the makeup, beyond the glowing lights of the soundstage, you'll see a girl from the desert who knew too much too soon, who smiled not because life was easy, but because she had survived. And so we move deeper, not just into the life of Barbara Eden, but into the strange, shimmering underworld of fame itself, where every spotlight hides a shadow, and every smile is a mask hiding something raw, something wounded. After I Dream of Jeannie ended in 1970, Eden found herself floating in a kind of limbo. She had tasted the sharp sweetness of cultural immortality, but she had also been frozen by it. The industry that once clamored for her couldn't figure out what to do with her anymore. The world was changing. The innocence of the 1960s had curdled into something darker. Vietnam, Watergate, the sexual revolution. And in this shifting landscape, Barbara Eden, the eternal genie, suddenly looked like a relic of a vanished fantasy. But she refused to vanish. She adapted, shape-shifted, clawed her way into new spaces. There were guest roles, variety specials, B-movies, and dramas that blurred the line between desperate and daring. She wasn't chasing relevance, she was fighting for dignity, for space to exist as more than just a memory in reruns. In 1978, she did something Hollywood rarely allowed its women to do. She aged. She turned 47. She wasn't the bubblegum blonde anymore. She had lines around her eyes, gravity in her voice, a heaviness in her beauty. But still she pressed forward, like a ghost who refuses to be forgotten. And then, in the silence behind the cameras, the real tragedy arrived. Matthew, her only son, her everything. Born in 1965, the same year Jeannie first danced onto television screens, Matthew had grown up in the long shadow of his mother's fame. He saw the glitz, the cameras, the adoration, but also the loneliness, the exhaustion, the endless pressure to be perfect. He was a child of Hollywood, and Hollywood, like all ancient gods, demands sacrifice. Drugs were everywhere in the 80s. They weren't whispered about. They were part of the air like perfume or smoke, and Matthew inhaled. At first it was casual, experimental, the way so many young men stumble into it, but addiction is a slow drowning. You don't realize how deep you are until the light disappears above you. Barbara fought. She got him into rehab. She prayed. She waited by the phone. She learned the sick rhythm of a mother holding her breath every night, hoping this wasn't the call. But one day, it was the call. He was 20 years old, her only son, dead from an overdose. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was obliteration, a wound that never heals, only scabs over again and again until it becomes part of your skin. The press reported it briefly. There were statements and then silence. But for Barbara, the silence was screaming. She kept working. She had to work, because when grief has nowhere to go, it turns into movement. You get up, you put on makeup, you smile into the light, not because you're okay, but because you have no other choice. And still, America saw the genie, not the mother, not the survivor, just the sparkle. The truth is, Barbara Eden's greatest performance was not on television, it was in life, holding herself upright after unspeakable loss, smiling when the world kept asking her to. And in those years after Matthew's death, she began to confront something even darker, the way Hollywood treats its women once they are no longer young. It is a silent violence, this erasure. One moment you are everything, the next you are invisible. No scripts, no auditions, just a slow fade into irrelevance. But Barbara refused. She returned to the stage. She toured in plays. She wrote. She told her story in her memoir, Genie Out of the Bottle, not as a fairy tale, but as a battlefield report. And when people read it, they began to see something new, or perhaps something they had refused to see before. Barbara Eden was not magic. She was human, and the truth was darker, richer, more painful than any sitcom fantasy. The woman in the bottle had always been trapped, not by a master, but by expectation, by myth, by the fantasy of eternal youth. Behind the scenes, she began speaking openly, in that same soft, careful voice, about the ways women are used and discarded, about the trauma of fame, about the mental health toll of pretending for a living. Her grief was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was in her eyes, in the way she paused when talking about her son, in the way she carefully chose her words, like each one carried the weight of something she couldn't say out loud. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The culture that once confined her began to change. Women began to speak out about abuse, about addiction, about aging, about survival. And Barbara, quietly, had already lived through all of it. There is something uncanny about Eden's legacy, something that doesn't quite fit the narrative. We want our icons to be simple, eternal, untouched by darkness. But Barbara Eden never had that luxury. She lived through the very heart of America's illusion-making machine, and emerged not just intact, but wiser, not bitter, not broken, but haunted, yes, and brave. Brave enough to remain visible, brave enough to age with grace, in a world that punishes women for time, brave enough to wear the smile even when it cracked. And isn't that, in the end, the darker truth hiding in plain sight? That the entertainment we consumed, the laughter, the shows, the fantasies, were built not on joy, but on the relentless sacrifice of real people. People like Barbara Eden, who danced in smoke for our delight while holding back the storm of their own lives, who brought magic into our homes while carrying heartbreak like a stone in their chest, who played genies but were never granted wishes of their own. If you look again at the old photos, you'll see it. The woman in the bottle, eyes shining, lips curled into that iconic grin. But behind her, the desert stretches out, silent, merciless, and real. Fame has a peculiar way of preserving faces while letting the soul behind them weather in silence. And by the time the 21st century arrived, Barbara Eden had become more than a woman, more than a performer. She was an image, etched into the American collective memory like a relic behind glass. But images lie. They show you only what they want you to see. And in Barbara's case, they froze her in time, young, beaming, forever in mid-twirl like a butterfly pinned to velvet. Yet the real Barbara Eden kept moving, kept aging, kept feeling everything. She had survived not just Hollywood's brutality, but time's slow, cruel erosion, the way it strips away friends, lovers, purpose. And even as her roles became fewer, even as red carpets became reminders of who was no longer beside her, she never once stopped showing up, because for her, being visible was defiant. But let's pull back now, not just from the woman, but from the machine that made her. The entertainment industry has always been a paradox. It gives you a crown and then tells you never to age, never to falter, never to let the crown slip. It sells nostalgia, packages innocence, fetishizes youth. And what Barbara Eden represented, blonde perfection, feminine submission, cheerful obedience, was never really about her. It was about what America wanted to believe about itself. That fantasy, sold in the heat of the Cold War and carried into the living rooms of millions, was never innocent. It was strategic. The genie was a product, soft, sweet, malleable. A dream without needs, a woman with no past, no rage, no age. But Eden was never that, not really. And in the years after the cameras dimmed, she began to tell the truth the show never could. She started speaking openly at events, not just about acting, but about surviving. About addiction, about grief, about the myth of the happy actress. Her tone was always gentle, but her words cut deep. She spoke of how show business polishes women into perfection, only to abandon them the moment they begin to show cracks. She spoke of the pressure to smile through heartbreak, to keep twirling when your world has collapsed. And in doing so, she carved out a new kind of legacy, not just as the genie, but as a woman who had lived beyond the bottle. And still, people kept asking her to wear the costume, even in her 80s, the pink silk, the sequins, the ponytail, as if the world needed her frozen there, untouched by time, sealed in nostalgia. And sometimes she wore it, not because she needed to, but because she understood something few do, that icons belong to the people, not to themselves. She wore it for the fans, for the children who had grown into aging adults and still remembered the magic. But you could always tell. It was a performance layered with melancholy, the kind of smile that says, yes, I remember who I was, but do you see who I am? Barbara Eden didn't retreat into obscurity like so many others. She kept showing up. Talk shows, conventions, tributes, theater productions in quiet towns. She laughed when others would have collapsed. She cracked jokes with the precision of someone who had seen too much darkness to let it win. And perhaps that is the true mark of her power. Not the way she enchanted audiences in her youth, but the way she kept walking through the storm without ever letting the rain drown her spirit. But the strangest twist in her story, the darkest irony of all, is that even as she aged gracefully into her 90s, society still saw her as the eternal girl. That's the cruelty of cultural immortality. You live on, but only as who you were, not who you've become. Barbara Eden had lived through wars, social revolutions, the death of her child, the collapse of entire film eras, and yet to millions she remained suspended in pink smoke, always smiling, always submissive. A fantasy they refused to let go of. And yet, she understood this. She never condemned it, because beneath the sadness of it all, she knew something deeper. That people hold on to magic because the world is hard. That characters like Jeannie gave people comfort during times of chaos. And that maybe, just maybe, being remembered as a symbol of joy wasn't the worst fate in the world. Still, she used that platform, even in old age, to rewrite the narrative. She became a quiet force for truth in an industry built on illusion. She reminded people that the woman in the bottle had dreams of her own, heartbreak of her own, wisdom forged not in fairy dust, but in fire. And now, As her name drifts further into the archives of pop culture, something strange begins to happen. New generations discover her, clips go viral, old interviews resurface. Young people, born long after the show ended, find themselves captivated, not just by the character, but by her. The woman behind the dream, the survivor behind the smile. They see the way she held herself, the way she spoke, the way she endured, and slowly the narrative begins to shift. No longer just a genie, now a symbol of strength, of endurance, of everything fame cannot steal. Perhaps that is the deepest truth Barbara Eden leaves behind. Not that magic is real, but that resilience is. That beneath every glittering fantasy is a human being, complex, bruised, brilliant. That behind every smile you've seen on screen is a history you'll never fully know. In the end, we don't remember Barbara Eden because she was perfect. We remember her because she kept going. Because she kept showing up when the lights dimmed. Because she let us believe in magic, even while she was quietly surviving hell. Because she proved, in 1,000 quiet ways, that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never get their wish, but keep dancing anyway.